Hello, welcome back. I hope you're doing very well. This is the second part in a little series of videos about techniques or practices that can help make your music more interesting. And by interesting, I mean the sort of thing that will grab a listener and make them want to keep listening throughout a whole track or a whole song. In the first episode, we looked at the concepts of groove and space, and I will put a link to that video up there somewhere. This time we're going to look at two concepts. The first is call and response, and the second is tension and release. Now, if you've not heard of call and response before, it's basically a technique or a practice where two phrases or two elements of a piece of music interact with each other within the whole or within sort of as part of a bigger piece of music. Now, last time when we talked about groove and space, we used Sex Machine by James Brown as an example of groove. And there's a really great example of call and response in there as well. It's quite sort of overt and in your face. It's when James Brown says, "Get up, get on up, get up, get on up." Those two parts or those two vocal lines are the call, which is get up, and the response, which is get on up. And the reason that's so powerful is for someone that's never heard that song, that a first time listener will hear that phrase once, get up, get on up, and immediately from that point onwards, whenever they hear get up, their brain says get on up before James Brown has said it. And it's to do with pattern recognition. It's our brains like that sort of thing. It really engages our brains and it's quite satisfying. So you can see how it's a powerful kind of tool to keep someone engaged in a piece of music. So we're going to look at melodic or kind of ways of using that in a piece of electronic music. The second technique, which is tension and response, is something or a characteristic about a piece of music which signifies change is about to happen. A really brute force example of it is a riser and then a drop in a piece of dance music, EDM or whatever. The build up of tension is the pitch rising in the riser and the sort of hi-hats or the snare getting faster and faster and faster. And then the drop is the release. That's the tension and the release. And again, it's something that it works because our brains like knowing what's happening or what's coming forwards. We latch on to signifiers. So those two practices of call and response, tension and release are very powerful if you sprinkle them through a piece of music in grabbing hold of someone's brain and making them want to keep listening. So anyway, it's enough of me talking. We're going to now jump on to the Akai force and demonstrate how you can put tension and release and call and response into your music. Okay, we're going to start off with a call and response example here. And to do that, I've created a little project. On the first two tracks, 1 and 2, I've got some drums and bass just arranged into a little kind of groove loop, basically. So this is what that sounds like. Sounds quite nice. There's a little bit of rhythmic interest going on there and the bass is nice and kind of tight. Now if I was going to turn this into a song, the first thing I would do probably is to add some sort of melodic content into it. So with that in mind, on track 3, I found a little synth sound, which sounds nice and it also fits quite nicely with that slightly organic feel that the drums and bass have. And if we look at the clip, you can see I've used an arpeggiator, and my first instinct is normally to go to an arp because I'm not very good at playing the keys. And it's a straight up pattern arp with just a little kind of flourish note at the end to bring it back round in a nice circle. And that's quite a standard thing to do, I think. And if we listen to how that all works together, it sounds all right. Perfectly fine, there's nothing wrong with it. But when we listen to that arp pattern, it's A, quite dull, and B, it's filling up all of the space because it's so constant, there's no kind of gaps in it. And if we were going to try and poke or push some other element into this bit of music, there's not much room for it. So what I've done is on the next two tracks, which are called ARP 2 and ARP 3, I've duplicated that that patch, so it's the same sound, but I've done something different with the MIDI notes in the clips as well. So if we take a look at that, you can see that it's the same arc pattern as we saw in this one, but I've stripped out the middle part, so it's only going up and it's not playing down. And then this second arp pattern, if we go to select, this is the same synth patch, but I recorded this part of it an octave down. And you can see those three notes which were in the middle, I'm now playing them on this different track, and they're in a slightly different order. So this, just to remind ourselves, this is what it sounds like before. Straight, no gaps, no call and response. And this is what the new arrangement sounds like when it eventually starts. So we've got that call and response with the original part, call, response. It's just a bit more interesting if we compare the two again. Nothing interesting going on here. And the other benefit about this call and response kind of method is we can now hear a gap in the middle. I'll point it out to you where it is. There it is. So we've suddenly found a nice gap, and I basically put a stab kind of pluck sound to fill that gap. So by using that call and response method instead of having the straight arpeggiator, we've got something rhythmic which sounds quite nice. We found a gap to put something else which helps us kind of grow our arrangement into something else. But there's also another thing you can do. If you get your call and response parts right, then they will work independently of each other as well. So if we mute out our response, that still sounds all right. And we bring the stab back in. That sounds quite nice as well. And if we want to bring our arrangement back from like a drop down kind of period, we could bring our response back in. So if we compare that again to our straight arc pattern, which is much less interesting to me. And that was as simple as taking our original melody line, which was an arp, and just essentially chopping that MIDI clip in half and pointing the two halves of that clip at two different sounds so that they are calling and responding, or asking a question and answering a question. Now, another thing you can do with this technique is copy all of those MIDI clips and then put them on to completely different synth patches. So as your progression or your arrangement progresses, you've got that same theme of the call and response with those two melody lines, but then as it goes down, you can put them to play vastly different synth lines or synth patches, which sound really different, but that theme of that call and response, that familiar kind of question and answer, is running all the way through your song, which is, as we said in the intro, the kind of thing that grabs a person's attention and makes them want to listen. The get up, get on up. This is the kind of melodic version of that. Not quite as exciting as James Brown, obviously. So that's kind of the first, a demonstration of the first principle of call and response. We're now going to move on and we will have a look at tension and release. So moving on to tension and release, I think anyone who's ever even listened to electronic music, let alone tried to make it, will be familiar with that kind of big aggressive riser and drop scenario I explained in the introduction to this video. So I'm not going to do that because I'm sure you guys all know that already. What I thought I would do instead is look at something which is specific to the force and specific to performing on the force as well. So to start us off, I've got two scenes here, techno-y kind of scenes. The first one's quite stripped back, quite kind of gentle, and the second one is a little bit more dynamic. It's got more going on. So we're going to listen to those two scenes, and in particular how they transition from phase one, which is quiet, to phase two, which is less quiet. So it sounds like this. Here comes our second scene. Pretty standard stuff for like an electronic or kind of techno track. Our second phase, the hi-hats go up to 16th notes. We get some extra claps and percussion in there, and we have a synth coming in playing an arp as well. So we move, it's a very obvious move from phase one to phase two of a track. But our transitions sounded fine, but there was no dynamism to it. There was none of this tension and release we're trying to build. So I've done two things. The first is I've plugged this PreSonus Atom SQ in. It's just a MIDI pad controller basically, and it's hooked up to this track here called Samples. And if we have a look at our sample edit, not that one, that one, Water Riser, you'll see that we've got a long sample, excuse me, one-shot sample here, which is actually made from a waterfall sample that's been processed, and it is 4 bars long, and it's playing as a one-shot. And I've done that for the simple reason that because it's 4 bars long with quite a quiet end, quiet beginning, I can hit it and fire it and then move on to do other things with my hands, and it will build into the riser that we want it to be without having to do anything else. So that's why that's there. That's going to be part of our tension building. The second thing I've done is create a macro, and there are two macros applied to this knob. The first one is looking at the hype synth filter cutoff. I'm not going to go into that in huge detail. You guys all know what filter cutoff does. As you wind it open, it opens the filter, which makes the bass get more aggressive and louder and just kind of more biting kind of character to it. And the second one of these macros is pointing at the drum kit, which has a filter on it, a low pass filter, and that is round the other way. So what happens is when I turn that filter knob, it's doing two things. It's winding the filter up on the bass, making it louder and more aggressive, and it's winding the filter down on the drums, which is taking all the high end out of them and basically making them quieter. And when that's happening in a piece of music like our first part, which is quite quiet, and you do it gradually, it tends to give the impression that tension is building and that something is going to happen, particularly when it's done in conjunction with our one-shot kind of riser. So that's the theory behind this. We're going to let our part one cycle through a couple of loops. We will then, when we're ready, we will hit scene two at just when it's started playing one of its loops, which will give us 4 bars to hit our one shot and start to build our macro tension. I'm bound to get this wrong, the timing's bound to be off, but we'll give it a shot. So one thing to bear in mind when you're doing this kind of thing where you want to trigger something that's going to build and do some other stuff leading into a transition, you need to have enough time between your scene changes to do that. So I have got my quantization set to 4 bars, which means that when I trigger the scene, it will wait till the end of that 4-bar loop to trigger the second scene. So let's see how this goes. So we'll let this go around once, and then we'll trigger the second scene, hit our one shot, it worked. So we basically built some tension there, as we have been hoping to do. It was a lot more subtle than the big riser and drop that you get in an EDM tune. One thing I just forgot to show you actually, macros. The key to this working with that macro is that it's on momentary. That means when you wind it up, you can do whatever you want, and then when you let go, it snaps back to its original position, which means you don't have to remember and get precisely back to where you were. So that in essence is a way of building tension and release that isn't huge and it's not aggressive, it's quite subtle, And because it's quite subtle, you could use it repeatedly without getting on people's nerves, basically. The benefit to having it done, to have the riser on the one shot like this, if you were to put it into a clip, you would have to put it at a certain point in the clip and it would launch every time you launch that scene. That means you have to very strictly plan your arrangement and play it. Otherwise, you'll get risers happening in places you don't want them to. Whereas having it as a one shot like this means you can trigger it whenever you want, which gives you loads more flexibility if you are improvising or just kind of jamming. It's a really nice way of doing it. The other thing is the trick with the two cut-offs, the bass going up and the drums going down. That doesn't have to be used as a riser or a transition. It can just be an emphasis point. It sounds quite good whenever you do it. Don't have to go into a new part. So as long as you get your timing right, that kind of style of transition works quite nicely. So let's give it another run. Nope, I screwed it up. I'm going to leave that in just to show you that everyone makes mistakes all the time, me included. Let's try that again. Build the tension. Something's going to happen. There it is. As I always say in my videos, please don't judge the principle or the technique on my musicianship, because that's a bit sloppy, if I'm honest. But anyway, I hope that was useful. So we've looked at two ways of building some variation and some interest of a sort that kind of messes around with the wiring in people's minds. That call and response speaks to pattern recognition. The tension and release speaks to the part of our brain that wants to know what's coming next and is satisfied when what comes next is what we were expecting. And if you, as I said in the intro, sprinkle those things just delicately or subtly through your tracks, it can take something from being an okay arrangement to being a really quite engaging arrangement, and they're really simple to do as well. Anyway, I hope that was useful. As ever, thanks very much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Cheers, bye.